have an unsolved case for you today, but it's solve unsolved, if that makes sense. And before I get to it, I want to go through a couple of legal definitions that you might find interesting or not find interesting, but we're going to talk about them anyways. You know how some podcasters, and really good ones too, like I'm not making any commentary about other podcasters, but how some of them will kind of tell the story on a homicide, but in a way that you don't really know who done it until like near the end. They maybe line up some suspects for you, kind of like how they do in movies to keep you sort of guessing and engaged. And you know how I always wreck it by like saying, spoiler alert, he or she didn't do it. And then I just kind of carry on with the story. Well, there's a reason why I do that. There's actually two reasons why I do that. One is that I'm not telling you a story, I'm telling you what happened. I think that stories are great. True crime is really entertaining for some strange reason that I've never really figured out. It's fine. You do not need to feel guilty about it to me, of all people. You don't have to justify it. And storytelling and narrating in true crime is really an art form. It's a gift that I probably don't have anyways, even if I tried to weave a tale to make it all sorts of interesting and intriguing. The other reason that I don't do it is that if I had to listen to, say, Sword and Scale do a podcast episode on Taylor, Shawn, and Alan's murders and left you wondering for the first half if maybe my mom, like Taylor's grandma, had something to do with it, or her aunt who suddenly had a podcast. I really don't think that I would enjoy that. If only for the small chance that somebody might like pause it halfway through and then that's kind of like their takeaway. Like, remember how my very first episode of Kimmy Thompson, I told you that my mom's takeaway of that story all those years ago was that her mom had killed her. It's kind of like that. So that brings me to these legal definitions, which you're going to hear. You'll probably hear three phrases always sort of tossed about rather haphazardly in true crime. There's witness, person of interest, and suspect. So both witness and suspect have actual definitions under the law. Person of interest does not. So I'm going to kind of give you a rundown of each by way of example. So I'll tell you a made up story. So please don't pause and walk away and think that I'm telling you something that's true that isn't. So let's say a cleaning lady arrives at it's a regular gig at her house. It's about 10 in the morning. She has a key. She walks in and she finds Susan Jones dead from a gunshot wound in her bed. So immediately, the cleaning lady is a person of interest, only in so much as the police will be very interested in talking to her about what she noticed, saw, heard, etc. Now, once she's cleared of any evidence pointing to her, she then becomes a witness. Now, a witness doesn't mean that she witnessed the crime. It just means that she might have witnessed by way of smell, touch, sound, or sight something that might lead to a suspect. Now, she didn't, so they talked to Susan's neighbor, Betty. And Betty says that she was coming home from the airport at 3:05 in the morning, noticed a red Dodge Charger backing into Susan's garage at that time. She didn't get a license plate, but she remembers the time because, of course, it was well past her bedtime. She'd been in Salt Lake City visiting her niece, and she had taken the red eye home. And she also remembers it because the car had this dark blue running boards along the side, which was unusual. So now Betty might be a witness. She's probably not a person of interest because there's nothing that would lead her that they would need to follow up on. She's just saying what she saw. So they run through the system, all the red Dodge Chargers that were bought with blue running boards, and one of them comes back to you, let's say. So you are the registered owner of a red Dodge Charger with blue running boards, and you live 3 blocks away from Susan. So you are a person of interest. You may or may not have had anything to do with Susan murder, but the police are now really interested in bringing you in for some questions. Now, it turns out all you know is that you were in Hawaii for a week. You just got back around lunchtime, but you lent your car to your cousin Fred while you were away. And when you got back, you noticed there was a strange smell in this trunk. Now, your alibi checks out. You're no longer a person of interest. Now you're a witness. So they show up at Fred's door, and he has these dark brown, reddish stains on his shoes. He says, "Yeah, I borrowed the car, but you see, I was kind of illegally poaching, and I dragged a deer to Susan's place in the trunk, backed into Susan's garage that night so that nobody would see, used her hacksaw to butcher it, and then I left." He didn't go into the house. He had no idea Susan was home, let alone dead. Now, Fred, of course, is a suspect until maybe the blood comes back to it is a deer. There's no prints, no physical evidence of him found in the house. And there's a message on her answering machine from Fred saying, like, "Hey, Susan, just letting you know I'm going to borrow your garage tonight." There's nothing to tie him to the crime. So he's not a suspect necessarily anymore, but he remains a person of interest because they're probably at some point going to circle back to him just to sort of make sure that his alibi completely checks out. Um, so you can kind of see how a person can go from witness to person of interest back to witness, all without ever really being named a suspect. So, what all this kind of boils down to is that a person of interest only means that you're a person that the police are interested in following up on, like for either witness information or possibly suspect information. And it could mean that you are completely cooperative, as Fred was. You just might have some information that maybe you don't even know you have the information that could lead the investigation a little bit further. Oh, there could also be something about your behavior or maybe your activities or your background information that warrant a little bit of further investigation by the police. To be deemed a suspect, police have to have a reason to believe or like probable cause that you directly committed the crime that's being investigated. Now, why am I talking about all of this? Well, in 1996 at the Olympic Park bombing, there was a guy named Richard Jewell who was named a suspect. Now, it turns out he didn't do it. He sued a bunch of people because people thought that he did something terrible that he didn't do because they kept using the word suspect. So they came up with this new term, person of interest. The other thing that's kind of helpful with using the term person of interest for the police is that if it's a person of interest, you don't have to read them their Miranda rights. However, you might be old enough to remember back in 2001 the anthrax mailings, where letters containing anthrax were mailed to members of the press and to two senators, and 5 people died in that. Well, the police started talking to this guy, Dr. Hatfield, who was an expert in biological weapons, and he completely cooperated. He gave them every information that he could. He passed a polygraph test. And then while talking to this environmental science professor at State University, Barbara Rosenberg, she said to the police, "Well, Dr. Hatfield is a perfect suspect in this case." And the FBI said, "No, like, we've already looked into him, he's fine." But then she went public with that and told a bunch of people that he was a suspect. So the FBI had really no choice at that point but then to just go back, research his place, all that stuff. And meanwhile, the press were calling him a suspect and sometimes a person of interest. They were but they weren't differentiating between the two terms. And of course, to the public, person of interest usually means suspect. So he was put under surveillance for 2 years, fired from his job. His life was completely ruined. So he filed a lawsuit against the FBI saying that releasing his name was a violation of privacy, and of course led the media to refer to him as a person of interest or suspect and not differentiate the two. However, because person of interest isn't actually recognized by definition under the law, they weren't responsible for ruining his life. Anyways, in the end, he settled for like $4.6 million. And now the police are extremely reluctant to ever use the word suspect, but they still go with a person of interest because it kind of absolves them of any kind of legal responsibility in that. Now, the media, however, they can still do whatever they want. And of course, when they use person of interest, they don't usually differentiate. And of course, the public sees person of interest as a suspect. So, all of this finally brings me to today's case with a few persons of interest that smell very much like suspects, but the police won't use that word, so neither will I. This is the Muskoka murders. There is a podcast on this story. It's called Cat Lady. It's by CBC Undercover. I think I listened to the first episode. Anyways, they go in quite in depth and they use witnesses from around the area that talk about this and that. But because none of this case has ever kind of gone to court, they're not officially witnesses, like they've never been cross examined. So I prefer to stick to the facts as they're kind of laid out in the police investigation documents. But if after listening to today's story you are interested in it, you can definitely check that out. It's season 4 of Uncover. Muskoka is actually not just a funny name for a place, but it's the heart of Canada's cottage country in Ontario with about 1,600 lakes attracting 2.1 million visitors every year. It's named after Meskoouki, who's a First Nations chief who's more commonly referred to as Chief Yellowhead. It's home to about 60,000 permanent residents, and then it has like 100,000 seasonal property owners, much like that Ozarks in the US. That's what Muskoka's kind of like to Canada. Includes some celebrities that have actually vacationed there or actually maybe still have vacation properties there. There's Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, Goldie Hawn, Kurt Russell. It's north of Toronto. It's very lovely, although I've never been there. There's a lot of times there's cabins or homes that have been passed down from generation to generation, and there's actually some really big money there. And one such family was the Laan family. It was a large family of devout Christians who sort of peppered their social media with posts about God, sin, the devil. I'm not really sure how down the line the family had made their money originally. I would probably know if I listened to the cat lady, but it doesn't really matter. The family had money. Chances are that the siblings, Paul, David, Walter, and Catherine, had come into an already wealthy family. Two parents, Anne and Shirley, and it was a family that sort of prided themselves on their selflessness and their charity towards others. As kids, they kinda just did normal stuff, played baseball, went to church, and then as adults, David went to the University of Toronto, Walter and Paul ran a contracting business, and Catherine married and volunteered as the treasurer at the local Christian school, and they were all living in Huntsville, which is Muskoka's largest township, but they had this property that was about 68 acres. Another well-known resident of Huntsville was 77-year-old Joan Lawrence. She was known by everyone as the cat lady. She's one of those fixture residents that no one really knows a lot about her. She's just kind of there. She'd walk down the road carrying bags of cat food for her 30 plus cats. She lived a life with really nothing. No one really knows what tragedy or life circumstances that took her from being a copywriter in the 1940s and a published poet to sort of living this dirty and kept lifestyle in a shack with no running water, no electricity, and barely enough money to feed her cats, let alone herself. Now, her shack burnt down in 1994, and no one really knows where she was living after that. She wasn't an unfriendly woman. She seemed to have all her wits about her. She just loved her cats. She never spoke about any family or her past life before coming to Huntsville and living this life kind of in squalor. No, shelters wouldn't take her, because of the cats, and Joan wasn't leaving her cats for anything, so she just kind of wandered around the area. Now, fortunately, it was around that same time that after her shack had burnt down, which of course provided her at least a little bit of shelter from the elements, that the Land family entered in this new business venture, that Joan could sort of benefit from their charitable ways of doing things. And the Land siblings and their uncle Ron opened up these three retirement homes on this very vast property of theirs. And they were recruiting elderly patients from Toronto that didn't really have any family to take care of them or were kind of down on their luck, which isn't too hard to find that kind of elderly here in Canada. The days of pensions have kind of gone by the wayside, leaves a lot of people in retirement dependent on their Canada pension plan and their old age security checks with little to no savings. Now, if you're not familiar with Canada's pension plan, it's one of those things you pay into it while you're working, much like your income tax on your paychecks. And then when you retire, you get a check from the government each month. It's based how much you get is based on what you were earning during the time that you were working. Now, just for some perspective on this, though, in 2023, the average person got about $789 a month. So it's really not much. There's also a 2,500 $2,500 death benefit that's paid out upon your death, which a person has to apply for it and then it gets paid into your estate. And it usually winds up going to the funeral home because it's specifically kind of for burial costs and what have you. Anyways, they wanted to have a place where this type of elderly person could go that they could actually afford. It was nice. They had dietitians, nurses on staff in this lovely cottage country. So they normally recruited Christians from around Toronto. And then, of course, they couldn't really take in Joan with the cats because and Joan wasn't going to leave her cats for anything. So the Land family offered her this garden shed that she could stay on their property, and this way she could have her cats. She would have a roof over her head. She really hadn't required much more than that. And the Lands would often offer her rides into town so she could buy her cat food. It was kind of a win-win of all sorts. Well, it wasn't exactly a win on all sides. At some point in the fall of 1998, Joan moved from that garden shed to the north side of the land property where they had like a line of old abandoned cars, and she had chosen it was like a white VW van, one of those 70 styles ones. It had these faded and torn yellow and black plaid seat covers, and she called that home. Now, no one really knows the reason why she abandoned the shed in favor of this once fashionable but now rusted out van. And in late October of 1998, Jones then stopped coming into town to buy her cat food. And she stopped making her trips to the bank where everybody always saw and knew that she would cash her CPP check and then she would walk outside and then hand the money over to this sort of reclusive man, and he would pocket the money and then walked away. The townsfolk just kind of assumed that she had probably died. They just didn't really think too much about it. One of the other residents at that retirement home, it was known as Cedar Pines, was 76-year-old Jeff Hurley. Jeff had lived a rather hard life. He didn't have a lot of money, nor did his son Michael. So Jeff had been really happy to learn about this opportunity to live in an affordable way in this lake country. So Michael would get updates from Catherine Laan about how his dad was doing, and when he called, she was always really happy to just tell him how he was getting along with the other residents and that. Now, Joan had a woman named Linda that spoke to her often. Now, she knew better than to talk about off-limit topics like her family and her past. And Linda considered Joan her friend, and she sort of wondered what had happened to this quirky elderly woman and her cats. And Linda mentioned to an OPP officer, Aaron Burke, who was of the missing persons unit, that maybe she could look into it for her. Linda she just didn't want to think of her friend, dying alone somewhere with her cats around her. Um, and of course, she didn't really want to think about what became of the cats if she had died out there. So Erin asked Linda what she sort of remembered about the last time that she had seen her talk to her, and she remembered that she had been asking Linda if she got her tax refund check yet. And Linda said, well, of course, it's October. She'd received hers in the spring. And Joan said that she hadn't gotten hers yet and that of course, she really needed the money for the cats. So she had told Linda that she was going to be looking into that. It was about $750, which was a lot of money for Joan. She had very meager means. She also mentioned that she was going to talk to her landlord about it, one David Laan, who often picked up her mail for her. Now, I believe the guy that did the Cat Lady podcast, his name's Xander. And he was really just kind of looking into this mysterious cat lady that disappeared 20 years ago. And so he turned over sort of the story to The Walrus, which heads a show called The Fifth Estate here in Canada, which is, I guess, kind of like 60 Minutes. They are an investigative journalist show, and believe me, they investigate. They are relentless in tracking down a story, and so they took up this story like gangbusters. And they even took the OPP to court to release what they had in their files. And this was in 2019, so just over 20 years after Joan had disappeared. And now there were facts that they didn't really need the court order to discover for themselves, and that was the criminal records of some of the townsfolk, particularly of the Land's siblings. Now it turns out David, the oldest of the siblings, have a criminal record for thefts and break and enters going back to when he was a young adult. Walter had a number of property offenses, once for impersonating an officer, and Catherine had actually done some time for drug offenses and extortion, but that was a long time ago. And in 1998, they were all good Christian citizens. They had outgrown their past, but right around the time that they were setting up these retirement villas in 1994, the school board at this Christian school that Catherine had volunteered as the treasurer for got a little bit suspicious of her that she never seemed to have any reports for them. She missed more meetings than she ever attended. She had kind of gone silent on everyone. And it turns out she had been embezzling money from the school to the tune of $30,000 and was arrested, charged, and convicted. But the really intriguing information came from the files that Erin Burke had kept while she had been looking into Joan's case. Erin has since left the OPP. She can't comment on anything, but her files are still intact. Aaron had spoken to David Laan, who said she was probably in New York or Vancouver or something, like on $900 a month she can afford a vacation. So Aaron didn't really buy that, and she looked into this tax refund check that she should have received, and the check had been issued and cashed, so she requested a copy of it. And it was endorsed by someone, but it hadn't been Joan. So she suspected the signature of the endorser was a Laan family member. Now, why would that be? Well, it turns out that for some reason, Joan, although perfectly capable of taking care of her own finances, as meager as they were, had a joint account with David Laan. And every month she would go to the bank, cash her CPP check, walk outside the bank where Ron Allen, David's uncle, would be waiting for her, and she would hand $700 of her $900 over to him, and he would walk away. So Joan used the remaining $200 a month to basically live on the land property. Well, that doesn't sound very Christian and charitable. No, it doesn't. Neither do the conditions of the retirement villas. Residents forced to eat nothing but boxed mac and cheese, which we call Kraft dinner, for 3 meals a day and really not taken care of at all. They were living in each villa was about 11 people crammed into 4 bedrooms with mattresses on the floor. Not exactly conditions fitting of villa names like Fern Glen Manor and Cedar Pines. Aaron also discovered that the joint account of Jones continued to be used after October of 1998 when she was last seen, but not by Joan. David had used a bank card issued in his name to purchase things at Canadian Tire, which is like a hardware store chain here. So let's see what else was in Aaron's notes. Well, there was the fact that over the years, Lance had been operating their retirement villas. 16 residents had died, which is not completely unexpected when the average age of the residents was about 77. But only 12 deaths were ever reported. Now, besides Joan, it seems that 3 other residents went MIA from Shady Pines or whatever they're calling it, including 70-year-old Ralph Doogie Grant, originally from Nova Scotia, with no family to report him missing. He just kind of stopped being seen around the villas. Irish born John Crofts, who had been a shoe salesman in Toronto in his younger days, and a former farm worker in his 90s named John Semple. Now, even more concerning was that all of the men's CPP checks were continuing to be cashed monthly. In fact, all of the 16 people had had their checks cashed and their death benefits directed to the Land family. And then Aaron found an informant who was willing to tell Aaron in secret that in October of 1998 he remembered seeing Walter Land driving a backhoe near the back part of the property where those abandoned vehicles were, including Joan's white VW van slash home. And he remembered that it was after dark he heard some gunshots coming from that area. Now, he didn't think much of it at the time. It was a very large property, and backhoes and gunshots were kind of common, although not usually after dark. Now, he didn't think too much about that until Aaron started asking around, and he realized it was sort of right after that that he stopped seeing Joan around. It was also around that time that Aaron started her poking around. This guy received a call from David Laan strongly suggesting that he should tell Aaron that he'd seen Joan over in Bracebridge just recently. Now, a pastor at the church told her that the Lans had asked him to come to Fern Glen and witness the signing of some documents. And when he got there, the forms were already filled out. and signed by everybody except for him as a witness. Now, he was uncomfortable about that since the documents were all banking ones giving him permission to change the residents' banking contacts and have their checks deposited into their account rather than the residents. So he went to each resident then and asked them if they knew what they had signed, and he refused to witness two of the documents. And one resident told Aaron that he hadn't received his checks in the mail and he didn't remember signing anything, but that he suspected that they had him sign something when he was under the influence. Now, one of their favorite types of residents were recovering alcoholics that they would offer booze to in their aging years. After all, you're in your elderly years. What's the harm in a drink here and there? So Aaron suspected that Joan was buried somewhere on the property, but her remains hadn't turned up anywhere. And she wrote that basically in her notes that she suspected that she was buried in the property. And they also tried searching the murky waters of Siding Lake, but there was really nothing there. A $50,000 reward was offered, but tips weren't forthcoming, and Joan, the two Johns, and Doogie's cases then went cold. So Aaron's notes, however, actually name David and Ron Allen as suspects, like not persons of interest, in the death of Joan Lawrence, but without any bodies, there's just no actual proof. When the Fifth Estate went public with their story, they were able to report that Walter, Paul, and Catherine had all been convicted on theft charges of over $100,000 by because they cashed the deceased resident's CPP checks. Charges against David Laan and Walter's wife, Karen, were dropped for some unknown reason, but no murder charges were ever laid against anyone. David started a repair business, and then after serving his 11-year sentence, Walter started working for him. Catherine moved around quite a bit before settling back in Bracebridge in Muskoka. Now, she denies any involvement in anything. Michael Hurley, whose dad had been living at that retirement home, had died when he was 76 in the hospital. His death was one of the ones that was reported. And at the time, Michael had phoned the Canada Revenue Agency to inquire about this $2,500 death benefit and had been told that the other applicant had already received it. He didn't really question it. He figured his dad owed money to the funeral home for the expenses and something. And when the OPP officers contacted him in 2019, when these cases were being looked into a little bit further, probably at the behest of a curious podcaster and a relentless Fifth Estate, Michael said, I didn't get suspicious only insofar as we couldn't pay the bill to the funeral home, but we didn't do any digging beyond that. Occasionally, I would get a phone call from Catherine, or occasionally I would call her to give me the rundown on him. That was probably his lifeline that kept him from either disappearing or dying quietly in a bed there. Jeffrey Manishin, who's a defense attorney, he was hired by the Laan family, including their uncle Alan. He wasn't very happy about the Fifth Estate investigative piece, and he tried to file a lawsuit against the Walrus and the Fifth Estate because he felt that the Laans could face vigilante justice because of the story and the accusations that were kind of within them. Now, they didn't like that the host, Bob McEwen's cynical tone, and then the reenactment footage that they used, which was complete with the missing persons flyers shown floating in these murky waters. He says, quote, quite apart from the potential of vigilante justice, the enhanced public scrutiny of highly dramatized commentary in all forms of media, including the nation's public broadcasters, have the potential for reaction at an international level, and that the story could affect their jobs and provide psychological and emotional distress, which may continue indefinitely. So I know many of you are probably wondering what became of Joan's cats. Well, I don't have a lot of good news for you on that. In December of 1998, about 2 months after Joan disappeared, the police found six of them on the property, all with bullets in them. Now, Ron Allen told the police that he had actually just scared them into the bush and that people fishing around the area must have shot them. But he later said that he couldn't remember where he shot them, but that he had been the one that had killed between 10 and 15 of them. In 2019, when the Fifth Estate did run their story, the OPP received quite a number of tips, and Detective Rob Matthews, who now leads the investigation, said, it's amazing. Many people in historic In historic investigations don't come forward in the beginning because they're scared, and as time goes on, oftentimes they believe that the police must have the information. I can say as a result of the press conference, we received a significant number of tips which allowed us to move this case forward. The missing piece of the puzzle is out there somewhere, and I'm very optimistic that we will find it. It's just a matter of time. I am optimistic that one day we'll be sitting in court and the individuals responsible will have to justify their actions. And that was the mysterious Muskoka murders and all of the persons of interest involved. And I'm going to be back again next week with another case. In the meantime, do your usual blah, blah, blah. Wherever you're listening or you're watching, just do whatever they say you can do. Subscribe, follow, rate a review, put a rate. And then on the podcast, please remember that you can sign up for the exclusive episodes. The links in the show notes. All those episodes are free from ads, and you get 2 bonus episodes every month.